When I first went to see the new Batman film in 2022, I had a very strange experience. As the movie credits rolled, the lights came up to reveal some 9 or 10 people in the theatre, and a guy sitting in the row in front approached me and proceeded to ask for my thoughts on the film. But then something even stranger happened. Everyone from the screening kind of congregated by the cinema entrance and began to exchange their thoughts on the film. It was a uniquely wholesome movie-going moment, but in both conversations, one sentence came up almost immediately. I don't think it's better than The Dark Knight. From that moment on, I knew that no matter how good the new film was, it was going to have to fight for a place at the top of the live-action Batman canon, wrestling with Nolan's Dark Knight for the #1 spot. Each film carries themes symptomatic of the time they were made in, and while they share many external features, getting to the core message of both films reveals just how different they are, and the difference between them says a lot about how modern society has progressed in the years since Nolan's trilogy. But now that we've had some time to reflect on the Batman, we can finally put this argument to rest. We'll compare and contrast, meaning we'll look at what makes them similar and what makes them different. I had to amend my thesis in this video, because upon rewatching the films and taking notes, I found that they complement each other in a number of very insightful ways that are easy to miss, and they share an astounding number of similarities down to the finest detail. Let's start with the basics. Obviously, we're dealing with the same character in the same city. In terms of genre, they're both somewhat of a neo-noir thriller. They both explore a relationship with Alfred, a romantic interest, and they both feature an interrogation scene with their main villain, and an interrogation scene with the Joker if we include this deleted scene. Looking deeper, we can see that both movies feature scenarios that involve exposing Batman's identity as a means of stressing the struggle between living these two conflicting lifestyles. They both have big punch-ups in a nightclub, and they both have plots that involve organized crime and corruption in some way. We have a rat in both mobs with Lau and Falcone, and both rats are killed by the main villain, who, much like Batman, is trying to expose Gotham's corruption. But their brutal methods are seemingly more effective, which prompts the audience to question whether Batman's code of ethics is really worth the lack of results. The last similarity is perhaps the most interesting to me, because when you crunch the numbers, you realize that both these characters have been Batman for roughly the same amount of time. You could never tell by looking at them, but if you don't believe me, look it up. There are some visual indicators in The Dark Knight that suggest that not a lot of time has passed since Batman Begins. Wayne Manor was burnt down in the first film, and it's still under construction in the sequel. You could argue that Bruce just hasn't had time to get round to fixing it yet. Fine. But at the end of Batman Begins, the Joker is new on the scene, and by The Dark Knight, he's only just making a name for himself. One of his lines of dialogue gives us our biggest indicator.
Let's wind the clocks back a year. These cops and lawyers wouldn't dare cross any of you.
So Bale's Bruce Wayne has been around for roughly 2 years, and the same is true for Pattinson, but they're at very different points in their journeys. Nolan's Batman is fully formed, armed with an arsenal of high-tech gadgets and vehicles, and refined, sleeker armor. Bale is mocking pretenders for wearing hockey pads, while Pattinson's suit seems to resemble just that. The Dark Knight features Gotham as a city that is reacting to Batman in the way he anticipated it to. His work has crippled organized crime, and the city becomes safer as a result. Bruce's main conflict becomes, I've done what I set out to do, now how do I leave this role without undoing all the work I've done? By contrast, this Bruce Wayne is making it clear from his very first monologue that his efforts are yielding no results. So while Nolan's Batman has reached his prime, Reeves' Batman is still struggling to get started. This is also reflected in their personal journeys across their respective films. But to understand more about their characters, we need to look at the story. One could argue that every superhero film tells the same story, and they might not be wrong, but I wouldn't put these two films in quite the same category. The character arcs and themes we're dealing with here go much deeper than hero fights villain, goes through challenges, and ultimately saves the day and gets the girl. Dark Knight is an interesting case because when you think about it, the hero loses. The Joker beats him in a battle of ideals, proving that even the best men can turn into monsters. Batman must frame himself as Harvey Dent's killer, retiring as a hero who loses his loved one, who dies before the third act. In a sense, he does beat the Joker in a battle of ideals, because by depicting himself as the monster, he is proving that he can be the unbreakable man that the Joker claims doesn't exist. But his actions lead to the idolization of a madman and a murderer, and they set the stage for catastrophe in the follow-up film. If we look at the theme and genre of each film, The Dark Knight is an action thriller, and it reflects the societal concerns of Bush-era fearmongering and postmodernism. There's a great video you can watch on this from The Take, which expands on this concept further. But essentially, the film is an allegorical response to 9/11 and the Iraq War, exploring the by any means necessary mentality of the US government and the Patriot Act, where brutal methods of torture were justified as a means to an end. Nolan has been very open about this. Taking on an action film set in a great American city post 9/11, if we're being honest in our fears, then we would come up against the idea of terrorism. These fears are explored in every aspect of the film. Batman breaches his code of ethics to find the Joker, hacking into every phone in the city in a mass breach of privacy. Lucius Fox poses the important question:
at what cost?
Clearly reflecting the fears and the mentality of the American people at the time. It's a theme that's even more relevant today, in a society where corporations sell our data to the highest bidder and the government's corruption becomes even more transparent in the information age. The Dark Knight is an action thriller. By contrast, The Batman is a detective thriller. But both films explore society's distrust of authority and corruption. Like many film noirs, The Dark Knight uses a terrorist to expose this corruption, whereas The Batman uses a serial killer. The Batman really leans into the detective aspect of the character, something almost every other on-screen iteration has failed to get right. Even in the best adaptations, there seems to be some confusion between wealth and detective work. This film understands that Batman is, first and foremost, a detective who can investigate, deduce, and draw conclusions from his own instincts before using goggles that recreate crime scenes or having his butler spoon-feed him all the relevant information. But more importantly, the film is a personal story about processing childhood trauma. Bruce is young, arrogant, somewhat egotistical, and apathetic. His view of crime is very black and white, and he finds it easy to judge criminals, which, as Selina correctly points out, is a symptom of his privileged upbringing. He's fueled by rage and a twisted, obsessive sense of vengeance for what happened to his family, to the point where he's become completely indistinguishable from the villains he's trying to take down. The public are legitimately scared of him, and they have every right to be. From his very first introduction, we can tell that this character is not quite the fully formed hero we're accustomed to. These street thugs perfectly set up the infamous line.
The hell are you supposed to be?
I'm Batman.
But when he replies,
I'm vengeance,
it's a subversion of expectation. His motives are clear. He loses control when beating this criminal to the ground, and his motivation stems from a deeply personal but also selfish intent. The conception of the traditional Batman comes from the idea that Bruce never wants what happened to him to happen to someone else. But here, Batman is just a vessel for him to take out his anger and avoid processing his trauma in a healthy way. He's a psychopath. Police misunderstanding a hero's intentions and viewing them as a troublesome vigilante is a classic trope of the genre. But during the crime scene investigation, we can completely empathize with the police officers. A grown man dressed as a bat being granted exclusive access to a high-profile homicide is quite literally insane. Part of the inspiration for this Bruce Wayne came from Taxi Driver. Matt Reeves read the Batman Year 1 2005 Deluxe Re-Edition, containing notes from creators Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli, who compared Bruce to Travis Bickle, an icon of toxic masculinity, and a prime example of the negative impact that isolation can have on adult males. Bruce even recites one of Bickle's infamous lines from the film.
2 years of nights have turned me into a nocturnal animal. All the animals come out at night.
Reeves also cited Jekyll and Hyde as another major influence on his version of the character, and these are not the typical inspirations you'd think of when creating a comic book superhero. This Bruce Wayne became a complete recluse after his parents' murder, and he stayed that way. Even Nolan's Bruce Wayne didn't cut himself off from society to the same extent, going on to study at Princeton University shortly before the events of the first film. Reeves has spoken at length about the man-child nature of his Bruce Wayne. When you dedicate your entire life to one ideal, it leaves little room to develop a personality, and even less room to develop basic social skills and the ability to form healthy relationships. Bruce suffers from age regression. He's mentally stuck at the age at which his trauma occurred, and his relationship with Selina Kyle really brings this into the spotlight. He becomes intensely jealous of her when he suspects that she has a past relationship with Carmine Falcone, and immediately judges her. He's also ignorant of his wealth and social status, and how other troubled individuals like Selina and Edward Nashton didn't have this safety net growing up. Reeves also discusses his childlike image of perfection in regards to his parents, and the discovery that they were not wholly good people shatters his entire worldview. Bruce has both figuratively and literally locked his parents away in the back of his mind, and becoming Batman was a way to cut himself off from any other relationship. never allowing himself to be vulnerable with anyone ever again. As I said before, his goal as Batman isn't to bring order and justice to the city. It's simply a vessel for him to take out his anger on it.
I haven't got time for this.
It's getting serious, Bruce. If this continues, it won't be long before you've nothing left.
I don't care about that. Any of that.
You don't care about your family's legacy?
Over the course of the story, Bruce is torn between two paths, each represented by a character. Gordon tries to reel him in and make him focus on justice and cooperation, while Selina tries to drag him further down the path he's already treading, the path of vengeance. But upon the discovery that he inspired the Riddler, who thinks that they're friends, he's forced to question what he's really doing to Gotham. They want the same thing, but the Riddler's more brutal approach yields better results. He's cut himself off from relationships and the ability to be vulnerable, but when Alfred's life is threatened, he learns that he can never truly numb himself to his emotions, and there'll always be someone to fear losing. Emotional numbness is not a viable long-term protective measure, so he has to be willing to open himself up. When he eventually does this in his personal life, he's also able to do it under the cowl, and provide support and help for others instead of just acting as a deterrent. Even though the idea is clearly foreign to him, he is trying, and he has to become an ideal to strive towards, not just a man to fear. This is hammered home through the musical motif. Even though composer Michael Giacchino wrote a lot of the score before production even began, he noted that the track All's Well That Ends Farewell was of particular importance. Reeves ended up using this theme in several scenes, notably when Bruce and Alfred discuss the shortcomings of their relationship early on in the film, and the emotional dissonance between these two men broken by the loss of the Waynes. It comes in again when they reach a resolution in the hospital, and once again at the very end of the film, symbolizing Bruce coming to terms with his trauma and beginning the healing process. Bale's Bruce Wayne tackles this internal conflict before he ever becomes Batman, overcoming his trauma and his personal guilt in relation to his parents' murder. He tells Ra's al Ghul,
My anger outweighs my guilt.
so he learns to harness that anger into something more productive, while also learning the power of becoming a symbol that offers hope to the innocent and fear to the guilty. He overcomes this internal conflict in the first act of Batman Begins, and the conflict of its second act then becomes, how can I become this symbol? Pattinson's Batman is dealing with both these challenges simultaneously. The Dark Knight contrasts even more so with the Batman in this respect. One character saves the city at the cost of being Batman. The other realizes they have to become a fully realized version of Batman at the cost of saving the city. He's not able to stop the Gotham flood because he hasn't fully developed his detective skills and was too absorbed in the personal side of his mission to see what the Riddler was really planning.
Your anger gives you great power. But if you let it, it will destroy you. As it almost did me.
What stopped it?
Vengeance.
It's him.
There's also a striking difference in each film's approach to Batman's alter ego. This Bruce Wayne has mastered the art of fabricating a public persona, whereas this Bruce Wayne has no alternate persona whatsoever. He doesn't see any merit in it. Generally speaking, a superhero is one persona and the person is another, and their personalities are often antithetical. One of the reasons Batman stands out is because the hero and the alter ego are one and the same. Batman is the only character. Bruce Wayne is simply a facade. Both movies understand this perfectly, but their approaches are entirely different. Batman Begins followed Bruce Wayne cultivating this public personality, buying hotels on a whim, fooling around with supermodels, and pretending to be drunk at his party. In The Dark Knight, we can see the instant transition from one persona to another when Bruce attacks one of the Joker's henchmen. It all culminates in this Lamborghini sequence, where Jim Gordon, the man who spent the most amount of time with Batman, has absolutely no idea that these two people are one and the same, because of Bruce's performance as an ignorant, clueless moron. It's one of the most interesting aspects of Bale's interpretation of the character. By contrast, this Bruce Wayne refuses to create any kind of persona at all. In just one movie, Pattinson has almost as much screen time under the cowl as Bale did in his entire trilogy. He is simply the Batman. He is pale, malnourished, lonely, and incapable of basic social interaction, even in public. There's a number of subtle details that communicate this neglect of any self-care, both in Pattinson's performance and the makeup and costume design. His pale complexion and the shadows under his eyes are realistic consequences of a nocturnal lifestyle. He only eats food because Alfred reminds him to. He has long, scruffy hair from a lack of any grooming, and he has to borrow Alfred's cufflinks for a public outing. And if we look closely, we can see his loungewear is just a shirt that came free with the purchase of his car that he modded into the Batmobile. All the trivial pursuits of life are just a complete waste of time. When Alfred walks in, seeing him watching footage of a girl he can only assume is a sex worker, his response is,
You a new friend of yours?
because he's just so desperate to see him form any kind of human relationship. While Bale is a natural womanizer, Pattinson can barely talk to women, and only really does so under his cape and cowl. Each film features a moment where Bruce Wayne has to tackle an obstacle in his alter ego. Bale has to save Reese from being killed by police officers. The main reason he approaches this task as Bruce Wayne is convenience, whereas Pattinson only ever tackles problems as Bruce Wayne when he's at his most vulnerable. The only exception to this rule being the mayor's funeral, where he would only be granted access to such an event given his public notoriety. It's the first time he realizes he can use his public persona to further his goals, but it's also the last time we see him use it in this way. Reeves constantly makes the character interact with the same people in both personas, as to stress the internal conflict that arises when stuck between these two worlds. Almost every character he interacts with treats him differently based on which persona he's using. The twins and Martinez reject him as Batman, but are starstruck by Bruce Wayne. Martinez can almost be seen as a vessel for the public opinion on him, slowly warming up to him over the course of the film. Selina vocalizes her distaste for Bruce Wayne, but falls for Batman. Gordon treats Batman as an ally, but even Reeves notes that he is annoyed by Bruce eavesdropping on their conversation at the funeral. The Riddler tries to kill Bruce, but he thinks he's best friends with Batman. Even Bella Real seems hesitant of Batman when he saves her, but she's keen to schedule a meeting with Bruce Wayne. There are only two characters in the entire film that treat him the same regardless. This is a device used to signal any characters who might have an affinity with Batman. One of them is the mayor's son, who seems to put his trust in him in both instances, stressing this idea that he's a reflection of a younger Bruce. But more interestingly, the only other character to treat Bruce Wayne and Batman the same is the Penguin. Bruce and Oswald's interactions are brief. At first, he's a little dismissive, but upon meeting him again in the Iceberg Lounge, he's very open and friendly. And when the Batman meets the Penguin at the same lounge, he's welcoming and flattering. This is mostly because, like Bruce Wayne, Oswald is constantly putting on a facade, with his true intentions only known to himself, and also because, like Batman, he feels like an outcast. He didn't come from wealth and has clawed his way to the top rungs of the criminal underworld, but he still struggles to garner any respect. This is something we see more of in the spin-off series. We can see completely opposite approaches conveying the same message, but in storytelling, the journey is more important than the destination, and each of these Batmen are going on completely different paths while working towards the same goal. Nolan's Batman highlights the facade of Bruce Wayne by displaying a stark contrast between his behavior in public and his behavior when he's alone, whereas Reeves' movie emphasizes the facade through an absence of it. Another trait that both films share is that they have central characters other than the protagonist who are arguably the main focus of the story, but the nature of those characters are completely different. In The Dark Knight, you could argue that the Joker is the main character, and that the hero is primarily defined by how he reacts to him. This isn't to say that Bruce is a passive protagonist, but the antagonist is the defining point of this film, and certainly the one that audiences remember the most. In The Batman, the antagonist is also another point of focus in the story, but it's a different type of antagonist, Gotham City. You may have seen interviews where a director says, "We worked hard to give this place its own character," or "this ship its own character," and that's because they are. Famous examples include the Millennium Falcon or the Overlook Hotel from The Shining. They have definitive traits, details, strengths and weaknesses, and a backstory. I think Gotham City is the place at which these two films diverge the most. I consider The Dark Knight to be almost flawless, but if I had to pick one flaw with the film, it would be that Gotham lacks any kind of character that sets it apart from a generic American city. Perhaps that's intentional, given that Nolan wanted to reflect the concerns of modern America. Batman Begins leaned into this a little more, though the griminess seems to be all but gone in the sequel. Reeves and his team worked very hard to give the city a distinctive look, filled with unique locations from the comics like the GCPD, the Iceberg Lounge, Gotham Square Park, City Hall, and the Orphanage, which was formerly Wayne Manor. Even small details like this add a sense of history to the city, coupled with ongoing events like the mayoral election and the drug crisis. Instead of shooting in a generic American city, they shot a lot of the film in Liverpool to give the film a baseline Gothic architecture, then layered over it with modern buildings to bring Gotham into the 21st century, while still conveying the storied history behind the city. Reeves and cinematographer Greg Fraser love to immerse the viewer by putting them in the character's shoes. This goes much further than your typical POV shots. Cameras are mounted to every vehicle during a chase, or buildings during a murder scene, and again with shots from the bomb disposal rover during the funeral sequence. It emanates a feeling that you're watching this through the same lens as everyone in the story, and it complements the already very surreal scenery that swallows you whole. Matt Reeves' vision for Gotham is very distinct, perhaps the most of any Batman film. Yes, you have your human villains like the Riddler, Falcone, the Penguin, the Joker, and a litany of corrupt politicians, but they're all a symptom of a city on the brink. Impoverished, inefficient, unsafe, and poor, these places breed corruption and desperation. While the mob turn to the Joker in desperation in The Dark Knight, the people of Gotham turn to the mob in The Batman.
You squeezed them, you hammered them to the point of desperation. And in their desperation, they turned to a man they didn't fully understand.
And you always fear what you don't understand.
The Riddler tries to destroy the mob through serial murders and exposing them to the public, whereas the Joker infiltrates their inner circle, makes them dependent on him, then destroys from within. Gotham forces people to look to other means for survival and prosperity, whether it be robbery, gangs, embezzlement, or rigging elections and covering up scandals. Alfred says he wishes he could say for certain that Falcone killed Bruce's parents, because it would give him a single name to point the blame at and exact revenge. But the reality is, it's not that simple. Gotham breeds criminals through its environment. It's this brutal cycle which led to the murder of the Waynes, and Bruce is taking out his anger on the city, treating the symptoms instead of understanding and curing the disease. Bruce is in constant conflict with the city. It's the source of all his trauma and the obstacle to all his goals, and he can't let go of it. Despite all the horror it's brought on him, he feels a need to stay there and try and fight back against it. It's an abusive relationship. The Dark Knight embodies these themes inside a single character, the Joker. His life was unfair, brutal, and tragic, and it turned him mad. He hates corruption and crime, but he equally despises the forces who fail to stop it. His answer to this is chaos, and he becomes an agent of it, provoking madness and unpredictability on a citywide scale, because that's the only way you can be fair. This twisted sense of fairness is what eventually brings Harvey Dent around to his way of thinking.
I try to show the schemers how pathetic their attempts to control things really are.
The Joker is everything Batman isn't, where one seeks order and justice, the other strives for chaos and punishment. But he hones in on Batman's nature as an outcast, and styles himself in a ridiculous attire to highlight the absurdity of Batman's own appearance. If a killer clown is insane, is a grown man dressed up as a bat any more logical? He uses these external similarities to seduce Batman into thinking they have internal ones, and it takes our hero the entirety of the film to prove him wrong. In the same way that Gotham feels alive in The Batman, the Joker provokes a similar feeling by making you feel a constant state of chaos throughout the movie, even when he isn't there. You never know when he's going to pop up next, and Nolan cultivates an atmosphere wherein anything could go wrong at any time. Nowhere is safe, and it places the audience in the position of Gotham's citizens. So while The Batman immerses the viewer by giving character to Gotham itself, The Dark Knight immerses the viewer through its antagonist and focusing on how the world reacts to every unpredictable move, always on the back foot. It's a case of visual immersion versus thematic immersion. In a time where audiences demand constant visual stimulation, The Batman might have the edge, but each approach is respectable in its own right. While we're on the topic of the Joker, I'd like to discuss the issue of comparison in relation to this character, because Batman isn't the only one suffering from this issue. When Joaquin Phoenix came onto the screen as the Clown Prince of Crime back in 2019, a similar comparison was drawn with Heath Ledger. While this was always inevitable given Ledger's historical performance, it's equally nonsensical. One is the protagonist, the other is the antagonist. One has an entire film centered around how they became the Joker, whereas the other is already the Joker when we meet him, with his origin story intentionally ambiguous through conflicting stories. When you think about it, Arthur Fleck only really has 2 scenes where he's the fully formed Joker. He's not even the fully realised version of the character during the talk show scenes. It's here on top of the cop car that he truly embraces himself and becomes the infamous villain we all know. This is very similar to Pattinson's Batman, who is never a fully realised version of the Caped Crusader throughout the film. There's so many differences between these characters that it seems pointless to compare them, but because they both dress up as clowns and commit a few murders, we inevitably do. What I find most interesting is that there is actually a film you could easily compare the Batman to, but no one ever thinks to. If you're looking for a story that focuses on Batman struggling to start his career, dealing with trauma, that also features Carmine Falcone in a major role, in a city with a distinctive gothic look, you'll find Batman Begins. The similarities between these 2 movies are striking, and the fact that this comparison is drawn far less often proves my point. The only real reason they're never compared is simply because Batman Begins is not nearly as popular as its sequel. People will always argue which iteration is better, And this video can't change that. With any reboot or sequel comes an inevitable dispute over which one is best, and it often boils down to subjective reasons, like nostalgia or which actor you prefer. I'll never forget what it was like to watch the Joker pop out of nowhere as a child, and having nightmares where he chased me across my neighborhood. On the other hand, I'll never forget that the Batman creates a realistic scenario where the Penguin is forced to waddle. It's an impossible choice. I do understand this desperate need to compare things all the time. It's a trend that's risen to new heights in the age of the internet, where people with similar interests can congregate online to discuss their opposing views. It's why tier lists are so popular now, and you might have posts come up on your feed prompting you to decide who would win in a fight between different groups of characters. Even movies themselves persuade us to compare characters. Just look at the number of films from the past few years that involve two pop culture figureheads battling it out. Batman was even in one of them. But at the end of the day, things don't need to be better or worse, they're just different. But that's an incredibly boring answer, so it's not a popular one. Nevertheless, I do see the merit in this obsession with ranking things. The process of categorizing your favorite variables in order forces you to think about them in different ways. It prompts you to identify what's important to you when it comes to a story or a character. If you like to escape to a gothic world filled with eccentric yet grounded characters, then The Batman is probably for you. If you like stories that offer a reflection of our own society through a different lens, perhaps The Dark Knight is more up your street. If I had to give a definitive answer on which one I prefer, I still don't know if I could say for certain. If we're speaking in terms of which film is a better action thriller, I'd probably have to say The Dark Knight. But if you ask me which is the better Batman film, I think I'd say The Batman. But in making the case for why you shouldn't compare the two, I found interesting connections and realized that they both complement each other in many different ways. I think The Batman is even more complementary to The Dark Knight than the other films in the Nolan trilogy. Perhaps the results of this comparison are a fruitless endeavor, but the journey we take to get there may be one worth taking.